Roy Deal had been doing masonry work in Lee County for 31 years, and he had opened a lot of walls. This was not a figure of speech. It was the literal work of his profession, the part that came before the rebuilding, the necessary destruction that made construction possible. He had opened walls in farmhouses and courthouses and school buildings and churches, had seen the things that walls accumulate over decades of habitation: old newspapers used as insulation, hand-scrawled dates and names left by the workmen who built them, bird nests in the cavities, the occasional animal that had gotten in and not gotten out. He had seen, in the walls of a house in Jonesville that was being renovated, a cache of Confederate currency that the owner sold to a collector for enough to pay for the renovation. He had seen in the walls of a church in Pennington Gap a sealed jar containing a folded letter in a language he didn't recognize that the pastor said was probably Welsh. He had learned, over 31 years, not to be surprised by what walls held. He had learned that the older the wall, the more it had accumulated, and that accumulation was neutral, not good or bad, just the natural consequence of time passing inside an enclosed space. The Copper Creek Church was the oldest wall he had ever opened, and what it held was not neutral.
The church sat on a two-lane road in the far western end of Lee County, close enough to the Kentucky border that on a clear day from the ridge above it you could see into 3 states. It had been built in the 1880s, white frame construction, a modest steeple that had lost its cross sometime in the middle of the last century, a cemetery behind it that was older than the building by at least a generation, the earliest stones worn smooth and illegible. It had been a serpent-handling congregation for most of its active life, one of the old-line Holiness churches that had been part of the landscape of extreme southwest Virginia since the practice spread through the mountains in the early 20th century. It had closed in 2003 when its last pastor died, and the congregation, which had dwindled to 14 members by then, dispersed to other churches or to nothing. A man named Dennis Kraft had bought it the previous year with the intention of converting it to a small music venue. The mountains of Lee County had a music tradition that could fill a room on a weekend, and Dennis had the business instincts and the local goodwill to make it work. He'd hired Roy to do the structural masonry, starting with the interior. The plan was to open up the space behind the raised platform at the front of the church, the old pulpit area and the baptistry, to create a larger stage. Standard renovation work. Roy had done a dozen similar jobs. He started on a Monday in October, which was his preferred time of year for interior work, cool enough to be comfortable, dry enough that the old mortar came away cleanly. His assistant, a young man named Keith, who had been working with him for 2 years, handled the prep and cleanup, while Roy did the structural assessment and the primary demolition. The baptistry was a raised rectangular tank behind the pulpit platform, built into the back wall of the church, faced in white ceramic tile that had gone gray with age. Standard construction for the era, a concrete basin, roughly 6 feet by 4, deep enough to perform full immersion baptism. Roy had removed 2 others in his career, both straightforward work. He assessed the Copper Creek baptistry on the first morning, tapped the surrounding wall with a hammer handle to map the cavities, noted where the plumbing had been capped off, and told Keith they'd start demolition on Wednesday. On Tuesday, he found the discrepancy. He was doing a more detailed assessment of the back wall, the wall the baptistry was built against, measuring for the stage expansion, when he noticed that the wall was deeper than it should be. Not by much, 8 inches, maybe 10, but the exterior dimensions of the church and the interior dimensions of the sanctuary didn't reconcile, and the discrepancy was located precisely in the section of wall behind the baptistry. Roy was a precise man. Imprecision in measurements bothered him the way a wrong note bothers a musician, not dramatically, not with any great emotion, but with a persistent low-grade discomfort that required resolution. He went outside and measured the exterior wall. He went inside and measured the interior wall. He did this 3 times. The gap was consistent, 9 inches of wall that structurally had no reason to exist. He told Dennis that evening. Dennis said, probably just how they built them back then. Old construction was like that. Roy said, probably, but he wanted to understand it before he started pulling things out. Dennis said, do what you need to do. On Wednesday morning, Roy removed the baptistry tile carefully, working from the top down, setting the pieces aside rather than breaking them. Old ceramic had a quality to it that modern tile didn't, and he'd learned that people paid for it if you kept it intact. Under the tile, the concrete basin, as expected, and behind it, the back wall faced in old brick, the mortar gray and hard. He tapped along the brick systematically, listening. In the center of the wall, directly behind where the basin had sat, the tap returned hollow. Not the hollow of a cavity, the hollow of a room-sized space, the resonance of it different in kind from a wall void, deeper and more complex. Roy stood with his knuckles against the brick and tapped and listened, and the sound told him there is a room behind this wall. He got Keith to help him remove a test section of brick, working carefully, 1 brick at a time, until the hole was large enough to get a flashlight through. He looked through the hole for a long time without saying anything. Keith asked, "What is it?" Roy said, "Go wait by the truck." Keith, who had worked with Roy long enough to know the difference between a request and an instruction, went. The room was approximately 12 feet by 12 feet, which meant it had been built deliberately. Not a forgotten utility space or a structural accident, but a room someone had designed, constructed, and then sealed behind a baptistry so that the only way in was through the basin itself or through the wall. The ceiling was low, maybe 6.5 feet, the same brick construction as the exterior walls. The floor was dirt. There was no lighting, no plumbing, no evidence of any utility purpose. There was a wooden shelf along the left wall, collapsed now, its contents spilled across the floor. There was something on the right wall that Roy could not immediately process and spent a full minute with the flashlight trying to understand. The drawings covered the entire right wall from floor to ceiling and extended, he would discover, across most of the back wall and part of the left wall as well. They were done in what appeared to be charcoal or a charcoal-like substance directly on the brick. No paper, no medium, just pigment on masonry. And they were children's drawings. He was certain of this before he could have articulated why, certain in the way that you are certain of the work of children without needing to analyze the evidence. The proportions were wrong in the specific ways that children's proportions are wrong. The hands were too large. The figures had a rigid frontality, arms slightly extended, that was distinct from adult folk art. The lines had the quality of hands that were still learning the relationship between intention and execution. Hundreds of them. He estimated this after he had been in the room for some time and had moved the flashlight across every surface systematically. Not dozens, hundreds, overlapping in places, covering every available surface, the work of many hands over what must have been a considerable period of time. Every drawing was of the same figure. Roy assumed though the figure was not gendered in any obvious way, stood facing forward in every image, arms at his sides or slightly raised, the posture of supplication or presentation. He was taller than the other figures in the drawings where other figures appeared. He had no face, not obscured, not turned away, simply absent. The oval of a head left blank in every drawing, by every hand with a consistency that could not be coincidental. Children drawing the same figure independently might have rendered him differently. These children had all left the same blank where a face should be.
At the base of the right wall, where the drawings were oldest and most faded, Roy found the dates. They had been scratched into the mortar between bricks rather than drawn, using something sharp, a nail maybe, or a piece of wire. Each date was accompanied by a name. He read them with the flashlight, moving along the base of the wall. Eliza, 1921. Thomas, 1921. Pearl, 1923. Harmon, 1924. The dates continued up through the 1930s and 40s, the names changing, the format consistent. He counted 27 name and date combinations before the dates stopped in 1958. He stood in the sealed room in the dark behind the Copper Creek Church and looked at 27 names scratched into mortar and hundreds of faceless figures drawn by children's hands, and he felt, for the first time in 31 years of opening walls, that he had found something he did not want to have found. He went outside. He sat on the church steps in the October morning and looked at the cemetery behind the building, and after a while he got up and walked through it, reading the stones. He found 11 of the 27 names, children's graves, most of them, the dates of birth and death close together, some separated by only a few years. Eliza Combs, B. 1914, D. 1929. Thomas Combs, B. 1916, D. 1931. Pearl Sutherland, B. 1918, D. 1937. The stones were modest, hand-carved in the local tradition, and some of them had epitaphs, not scripture verses, not the standard consolations, short phrases that Roy read twice, trying to find the comfort in them and failing. She saw his face at last. He went to stand before him, received into his countenance. Roy stood in the cemetery with his hands in his jacket pockets and read those words and looked back at the church and thought about the room behind the baptistry and the blank faces on the wall and the names scratched in the mortar and the dates that ran from 1921 to 1958. And he thought about what it meant for a child's gravestone to say, "She saw his face at last," when that same child had spent years in a sealed room drawing a figure with no face. He went back inside and measured the room carefully and photographed every wall and wrote down every name and date he could read in his notebook. He did this with the deliberate thoroughness of a man who knows he is doing something that needs to be done right because it will only be done once. When he was finished, he stood in the room one more time and looked at the drawings. In the lower right corner of the back wall, at roughly a child's eye level, was a drawing slightly different from the others. The faceless figure was the same posture, same blank oval, but around it, in this drawing only, the child had added something. Hands. Not the figure's hands, other hands, surrounding the figure, reaching toward it from the margins of the drawing, from outside the frame, as if whatever the figure was, it was being reached for from every direction simultaneously. Roy looked at this for a long time. Then he went outside and called Dennis.
Dennis came that afternoon. Roy showed him the photographs on his phone first, sitting in the truck, because he wanted Dennis to have the information before he had the experience of the room. Dennis was a practical man, and a decent one, and Roy had worked for him twice before and trusted his judgment, and he wanted that judgment to be operating before Dennis stepped through the hole in the wall. Dennis looked at the photographs without speaking. He went through them twice. Then he said, "The names in the mortar. You checked the cemetery. 11 of them are out there, children. The grave markers say..." Roy showed him the photographs of the stones. Dennis read, "She saw his face at last," and was quiet for a moment. "The others, the names you didn't find stones for. I don't know. Could be buried elsewhere. Could be family plots on private land. Could be they left the county." Roy paused. "Could be other things." Dennis looked at the church. How long was that room sealed? Based on the mortar work and the brick, and based on the last date I found in the wall, 1958, I'd say at least 60 years, maybe longer. The congregation didn't close until 2003. Roy said nothing. He let Dennis sit with the arithmetic. Dennis sat with it. So they sealed the room while the church was still active, while people were still coming here every Sunday. Yes, while the pastor was still preaching and the congregation was still... Dennis stopped. He looked at the cemetery. The serpent-handling, the Holiness tradition. They believed in direct experience of the divine, visions, glossolalia. They believed the spirit moved physically, that you could be touched by it. I know what they believed, Roy said. I grew up in a church 2 counties over that wasn't far from it. Dennis was quiet. What do you think happened in that room? Roy had been thinking about this since morning. He had not arrived at a comfortable answer. I think someone in this congregation believed that children were more open to something than adults were, that their receptiveness, their willingness to see was a quality that could be cultivated. He paused. I think they put children in that room and they asked them to draw what they saw. And I think what those children saw, every one of them, every hand on that wall, was the same thing, the same figure, no face. Dennis looked at the photographs again. The figure reaching from outside the frame. One drawing, the last one, I think, based on where it is on the wall. What do you think it means? Roy took a breath. I think a child drew what it looked like when the thing they'd been shown came close, when it stopped being something you saw from a distance and started being something that was reaching for you. Dennis didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, I need to think about whether I'm going to open this up or seal it back. Roy said, I'd seal it back. I know you would. Dennis looked at him. I need to think about those names, the ones not in the cemetery. I need to think about whether there's an obligation there. Roy understood this. He also understood something else, something he had felt in the room that he was having difficulty putting into words for a man who hadn't been in it. The room had not felt empty. He knew the feel of an empty space, the specific acoustic and atmospheric quality of a sealed room that had not been occupied for 60 years, and this had not felt like that. It had felt like the pause before a sound, the moment of held breath before something speaks. He did not say this to Dennis. Dennis was a practical man, and he needed to make a practical decision, and Roy's feelings about the quality of silence in a sealed room were not going to help him make it. He said, whatever you decide, decide soon. I don't want that wall open over the weekend. Dennis decided the following morning. He called Roy at 7 and said, seal it. He said, I talked to a historian at the University of Virginia last night, sent her the photographs, and she said she'd want to document the room properly before anything was disturbed, and that documentation could happen without the wall staying open. He said, we'll let the historian do her work, and then we'll seal it back exactly as it was, and we'll build the stage in front of it, and the music will play, and that'll be that. Roy said, all right. He spent Thursday and Friday sealing the room. He reset the brick carefully, matched the old mortar as closely as he could manage, and when he was finished, the back wall of the Copper Creek Church looked like a back wall. The historian came the following week with her camera and her notebook and spent a full day in the room. Roy did not go in again. He had no reason to go in again, and several reasons not to. The Copper Creek music venue opened the following spring. Dennis had done a good job with the renovation. The space was warm, and the acoustics were excellent, and the first few months of weekend shows drew crowds from 3 counties. Bluegrass, old time, the occasional singer-songwriter who'd heard about the room and wanted to play it. The mountain music sounded right in there, the way music sounds right in a space that has held a long history of people raising their voices. Roy went to one of the early shows. He stood near the back and drank a beer and listened to a quartet play fiddle tunes that were older than the church itself, older than any building in the county. The tunes that the mountains had been passing from hand to hand since before anyone wrote them down. It was good.
It was genuinely good. The music and the people and the October night outside the windows. He did not look at the back wall. He made a deliberate choice not to look at the back wall, and he held to it for the full 2 hours of the show. He has been back twice since. Each time he makes the same choice. Each time he holds to it. He has never told Keith what he saw through the hole in that wall. Keith asked once, and Roy said, "Old church stuff, not interesting." And Keith had let it go because Roy's tone made letting it go the obvious option. He has thought sometimes about the children's graves in the cemetery behind the building, about "she saw his face at last," and what it meant for the thing on that wall to have no face, about the last drawing, the hands reaching from outside the frame, from every direction toward the figure at the center. He has thought about the fact that the room did not feel empty. He has thought about what it means to play music in a room built over a sealed space, to fill it with sound and people and the ordinary joy of a Friday night in the Virginia mountains, and whether that is enough to change the quality of what is underneath. Whether sound and living presence can do what 60 years of silence could not. He doesn't have an answer. He's a mason, not a theologian. He works with what he can measure. But he doesn't look at the back wall. And when the music stops between songs, in that brief moment of quiet before the next tune starts, he has noticed, and he notices it every time without fail, in the silence between one song and the next, that the room holds the quiet differently than it should, as if something in it is very still and listening, and has been listening for a long time, as if it is waiting with the patience of something that has waited before, to be seen.